So far throughout the multiple different phases and instances of Classic WoW, Warlocks have generally kept to two main specs, Demonic Sacrifice Ruin and Shadow Mastery Ruin. But are these really the only viable builds for AQ40? Or perhaps are there more options? What if we left behind the Shadow specs that we know and instead tried a different school of magic that Warlocks possess? Fire. Before we get into the different talent builds that we can choose from, first let's talk about what spells we're going to be looking to use in this spec and how they work. First of those being your main casting spell, Searing Pain. Searing Pain is actually a quite low damaging spell, only having 43% spell power coefficient and giving us 200% threat. This is going to be our primary filler spell, similar to what Shadow Bolt is in the Demonic Sacrifice spec. Our damage over time effect, similar to what we use now as Corruption, is going to be Immolate. Immolate has an 18.6 spell power coefficient on its direct damage and has a 63.6 spell power coefficient on its damage over time. And this spell is then modified further when you have tier 2.5 and 5 out of 5 into improved Immolate, but we'll talk about those numbers a little bit later. The next spell is the juiciest one of them all, and probably one of my favorite Warlock spells in Classic WoW, and that's Conflagrate. Now, don't get me wrong guys, but I think that Conflagrate is not working as intended. At least, not how I read it. So, every single 1.5 second cast spell, or instant cast spell, has a baseline spell power coefficient of 43%. And Conflagrate reads that it is an instant cast spell that consumes the damage over time effect from Immolate. The damage over time effect from Immolate is 63% spell power coefficient. So since Conflagrate is a baseline instant cast spell and has baseline 43% spell power coefficient, and then it consumes Immolate, you would think that it has 100% spell power coefficient. And technically it would be 107% spell power coefficient, but all spells in Classic WoW are capped at 100% spell power coefficient. So technically it should be 100% spell power coefficient. At least that's how I see it in my eyes. Maybe you guys see it differently. I don't know, comment in the comment section below and tell me what you guys think, but that's how I see the spell working. However, that is not how Conflagrate works in Classic WoW. It seems that when you use Conflagrate, it doesn't have a baseline 43% spell power coefficient for being an instant spell, and then adds the damage over time effect on top of that. No. Instead, Conflagrate consumes the Immolate damage over time effect, and just inherits that damage over time effect's spell power coefficient, aka 64% spell power coefficient. Now, does this make Conflagrate a terrible spell? No, it's still very good. Normally, 1.5 second cast spells or instant cast spells normally have a 43% spell power coefficient. But this one ends up having 64% spell power coefficient. So no, it's not a terrible spell, it's actually quite good. But is it as good as it should be? Not in my opinion, but maybe this is working as intended. It just doesn't seem that way to me. But, you know, I might be a little bit biased. Now, one might ask, isn't Conflagrate not that good? Even though it has an increased spell power coefficient, it requires preparation. It requires you to have Immolate on the target first. Well, that's not really that much of a problem, because Immolate with 3-piece tier 2 and having 5 out of 5 into improved Immolate, it will end up doing about the same damage as your Searing Pain anyway, which is your 1.5 second filler spell that you're going to be casting normally regardless. So if Immolate is doing about the same damage as Searing Pain, then it doesn't really matter that you have to cast Immolate in preparation for Conflagrate, because you're going to be casting a 1.5 second cast spell anyways, and they deal about the same damage. It's also important to note that when Conflagrate consumes the Immolate damage over time effect, it doesn't look at how much time is left in your Immolate's damage over time. If you use Conflagrate right after you put Immolate up, it will do the same exact damage as if you were to use it 0.1 seconds before Immolate falls off. It doesn't matter how much time has passed in the Immolate's damage over time effect. The last spell that I'm going to talk about is, of course, Soulfire. And you might say, well, isn't this the most powerful spell we have? It scales 100% spell power. Yes and no. So, in Classic WoW, the maximum spell power coefficient you can have on any spell is 100%. And you get 100% spell power coefficient on any spell that is 3.5 second baseline cast. Anything over 3.5 seconds, and you're adding more cast time to the spell, but not gaining any spell power benefit. A good example of this is Soulfire. Soulfire is over 3.5 second cast, but it doesn't scale additionally with any more extra spell power. So, Soulfire isn't that good of a spell. It has a cooldown, it consumes a soul shard, and it's over 3.5 seconds without gaining any additional benefit. So I would use Soulfire if you want to pre-cast on a mob or pre-cast on a boss, but I would not use it mid-combat, as it's not quite that efficient. Alright, so let's jump right into the first build that we're going to talk about, and that is going to be the Conflagrate build. 5, 9, 37. And yes, 37. We want to put a ton of points into the destruction tree to pick up all the juicy talent points, such as Conflagrate, of course, Ruin, which we always have to get, Emberstorm for that fire damage, Shadow Burn, improved Searing Pain, all that good stuff. And also notably, we pick up 2 out of 2 improved Imp Firebolt. Moving on to the Demonology tree, we pick 3 out of 3 improved Imp, 2 out of 5 Demonic Embrace for a little bit extra stamina to survive, 4 out of 5 Fell Intellect, and then lastly, moving on to the Affliction tree, we have 5 out of 5 improved Corruption. And hold on, I know what you're thinking. Alive, this is supposed to be a fire build. I'm watching this video for fire damage. Why are you telling me to cast Corruption? And my raid leader is not going to let me put Immolate up and Corruption. That is not going to happen. I agree, I totally understand. Normally, you're not going to be able to put up Immolate and Corruption on a single target mob because you just won't have the debuff slots to do that. However, there's a ton of damage that Warlocks can gain through trash damage in the later stages of the dungeons, particularly in the trash that comes after Twin Emperors, the Mindslaver trash, the Slayers, the Champions, and things of that nature. Typically, these packs are spread out and killed one at a time, allowing for the Warlock to really gain huge benefits from their damage over time effects, popping Talisman or Zandalar Hero Charm and getting tons of multi-dots out. This is why we go into improved Corruption, because during those times, yes, you may not be Shadow Spec, but you can move your character into position in whatever position you need to be in, while also applying damage. In a single target scenario, this spec is going to be looking to cast Immolate straight into Conflag to get it on cooldown, since it's our most powerful spell, back into Immolate, into Searing Pains to fill as we get another Conflag off cooldown. During that time, we also want to make use of our Imp, since our Imp actually does quite a bit of damage with full stacks of Scorch on the boss, Curse of Elements on the boss, or any other damage modifying effects, since our Imp is going to be casting every 1 second with 30% more damage. Additionally, you can pre-pop Black Book trinket and then swap to another trinket before entering combat with any boss, and your imp will keep the 30-second buff from Black Book trinket even though you swapped your trinket away for something else. The second build we're going to look at is 0-2130, also known as Demonic Sacrifice Emberstorm. This build is looking to utilize as much % fire damage modifiers as possible. By going down into the demonology tree for Demonic Sacrifice, giving yourself 15% more fire damage. On top of that, you get the 10% fire damage from 5-5 Emberstorm in the destruction tree, for a grand total of 25% fire damage. Now, compared to the Conflagrate build, this build has a much more simplistic playstyle. You keep up Immolate on the boss just like you would with a Corruption, and then you spam Searing Pain. This build is going to give our Searing Pain 15% more damage than the previous build, making our filler spell a lot stronger. Additionally, with the 15% extra fire damage, you're also going to have stronger damage over time effect from your Immolate, which means not only is that good for single target, but that's also extremely good for any multi-dotting situation. On top of that, you get the extra goodies that the demonology tree normally packs for you, which is a bunch of stamina through Demonic Embrace, Fell Domination to instantly summon a Voidwalker for a shield, and all of that good stuff as well. Now, some of you guys might be asking, okay, which one of these two builds is actually the best? And they're actually both good in their own right, but at different things. The Demonic Sacrifice Emberstorm build is going to have more reliable long-term damage because you're not using a lot of Immolates and Conflagrates, which spend a lot more mana when compared to Searing Pain. Additionally, the DS Emberstorm has more % fire modifiers in the talent build, which means your AoE damage is also going to be much stronger. So if your guild uses a lot of AoE strategies, this build will maximize the amount of AoE damage you can output. Now when we look at the Conflag spec, Conflag, it might be a little bit weaker than Demonic Sacrifice Emberstorm on AoE, but between having your imp doing a ton of damage before it goes swapping your Black Book to get more imp damage, having your Conflagrate do much more damage than your Searing Pains, and so on, you'll have more single target damage potential than the Demonic Sacrifice build. And it feels a lot more fun as well, at least for me personally. It felt like a ton of fun to play this spec. However, I do have to admit that while this spec is very fun to play and has good single target potential, it gets much worse the longer the fight goes on. Your imp will itself quite fast, and on top of that, requires you to cast more Immolates and Conflagrates than compared to the Demonic Sacrifice Emberstorm build. And Immolate and Conflagrate cost considerably more mana than Searing Pain does, meaning that you as a Warlock will go much faster than the Demonic Sacrifice Emberstorm build, simply due to the DPS rotation of this build. Lastly, it's important to remember that your imp does not have that much health, so anytime you use it for damage, it will do good damage, but you have to use it wisely, because it will die to most effects and most abilities in AQ40. So you need to choose wisely when to phase it in and phase it out, to be careful to try to keep it alive while also trying to use it for damage. Alright, let's look at what kind of gear we're going to use for this fire build. And the first setup we're going to look at is the setup that we all know and love, the build that uses Bloodvine. Now, this Bloodvine setup has 14% hit rating, which is 2% away from hit cap. Very, very nice. On top of that, we use our typical AQ40 BIS pieces such as Doomcaller's helmet, shoulders, Eyestalker waistcord, Darkstorm gauntlets, and things of that nature. This second gear setup is for those of you that are sick and tired of wearing that damn Bloodvine set. I can't blame you. I don't like wearing the Bloodvine either. It's ugly. Not only is it ugly, but it doesn't have any stamina on it. So this setup is going to be quite similar in DPS output. Not exactly the same, but similar. But you're not using the Bloodvine setup. This setup exchanges 49 more spell power than the last setup, but loses 4% hit rating. So this setup is going to have a higher damage ceiling, but slightly less consistent. Other notable changes in this setup include we're now using Doomcaller 3-piece setup, which means that our Immolate is going to be stronger with this setup compared to our other setup. And not only is our Immolate going to be stronger, of course, because of the 3-piece setup, but once again, we do have more spell power, which means our Immolate damage over time is going to be that much better. This third gear setup is going to be a gear setup that I had mentioned in previous videos, a gear setup that's going to look at using Nat Pagel's Broken Reel for a quick boss fight to get an extra boost in stats. This setup is looking to utilize Hazard's Charm of Destruction at the same time as Nat Pagel's Broken Reel, not only to get 16% hit rating for absolute hit cap on your hit rating, but also to get huge amounts of spell crit. Now, exactly how much spell crit do I mean by huge amounts? Well, let's get into it. This gear setup has 13.5% chance to crit without talents. If you add the 5 points we have in Devastation from the Destruction Tree, that's another 5% crit. Now we're at 18.5. Then you add 5 points into Improved Searing Pain. That's another 10% crit for our Searing Pain. So now we're at 28.5. Then we activate Hazard's Charm of Destruction, which increases our critical strike chance on destruction spells by 10%. Now we're at 38.5% chance to crit on our Searing Pain. Well, you think that's pretty high, huh? Well, let's not forget about world buffs. With world buffs, we're getting 18% crit chance, 10% from Onyxia, 5% from Songflower, 3% from Dire Maul Tribute. What crit are we up to now, you might be asking? Now we're up to 56.5% chance to crit on our Searing Pain. Does it stop there? Kinda yes and no. So, technically, we don't have anything else that will give us flat percent chance to crit. However, we do have Infallible Mind, the Blasted Lands buff for 25 more intellect. We will be getting Arcane Intellect from mages. The ZG buff is also going to scale our intellect up. And of course, if you're Alliance, you can be a gnome and also have Blessing of Kings. So, if you're Alliance, if you have all of these different intellect buffs, you can get nearly 62% chance to crit on your Searing Pain. So not only will you have 62% chance to crit on your Searing Pain with Hazard's Charm of Destruction, but with this gear setup, you will also have 16% chance to hit. So you're going to be hit capped and have 60% plus chance to crit with your main primary damaging spell. This is the last gear setup we're going to look at, and I don't necessarily think this is the best gear setup, but I want to explain what this gear setup does because it does have a little bit of a niche. I'm sure you'll notice right off the bat that the only changes in this gear setup is that we're using 3-piece bonus of the PvP epic set. Now, why is that? The 3-set bonus reads, reduce the casting time of your Immolate by 0.2 seconds. Our Immolate, with the Destruction Tree talents, already makes the cast time 1.5 seconds. And normally, all global cooldowns in World of Warcraft are 1.5 seconds. So technically, if we cast a 1.5 second spell quicker than 1.5 seconds, it's not really helping us because we still have to wait for the GCD. However, that's where the niche comes in. With this particular 3-set bonus, anytime you cast Immolate, it changes your global cooldown for that spell cast from 1.5 seconds to 1.3 seconds. So with this setup, you can have 1.3 second Immolates with no penalties on your GCD. Now, why is this setup so much more mana intensive? That's because with this setup, instead of casting Searing Pain, you'll just want to be casting Immolates over and over and over. And even if you were to downrank one time on Immolate to make use of the damage over time of a max rank Immolate, this spec is still going to use a ton of mana, because not only are you casting faster, but Immolate costs considerably more mana than Searing Pain. And let's not forget that in both of these fire talent trees, we're missing 2 out of 2 improved life tap, so gaining mana back isn't as easy either. Regardless, it is a pretty cool interaction, and it was something I wanted to mention while talking about these different gear setups. So, why would you even want to go this fire spec? Is it even better than Shadow? Let's get into the pros and cons of that. First, the pros. Much of the trash damage we do in AQ40, especially before Twin Emperors, is AoE damage. This means we rely heavily on Hellfire and Rain of Fire, which receive a DPS increase with these fire builds. Using Fire Warlocks also allows for more manageable debuffs for the raid. Shadow Warlocks rely on Curse of Shadows and Shadow Weaving, which for most guilds means having a Shadow Priest in your raid, which is also going to use 2 additional debuff slots by using Mind Flay and Shadow Word Pain. That's 4 debuff slots without even counting any corruptions. With Fire, you don't need a Shadow Priest, which takes away Shadow Weaving, Mind Flay, and Shadow Word Pain. On top of that, if both of your Warlocks or however many Warlocks you have in your raid are all Fire, then you also can drop Curse of Shadows. That is 4 debuff slots saved alone, which is a quarter of the total debuff slots allowed. The fire specs will also increase your threat generation on both Twin Emps and Oro. And we'll talk about the Oro tactic later if you're not aware of what the Oro Warlock tanking tactic is. Lastly, fire damage has very similar debuff modifiers compared to Shadow, especially if you have Arcanite Dragonlings in your guild. When looking at Shadow, we have 15% from Demonic Sacrifice, 20% from Improved Shadow Bolt, 15% from Weaving, 10% from Curse of Shadows, totaling up to 60% increased shadow damage. For Fire, we have 15% from Demonic Sacrifice, 10% from Emberstorm, 15% from Scorch, and 315 additional spell power from Flame Buffet from the Arcanite Dragonling. 10% Curse added on top of this adds up to 50% fire damage and 315 spell power to Fire from the Arcanite Dragonling. So even though we're Fire, we're not really missing out on too many debuff modifiers either. Okay, now let's look at the cons. Let's look at the downsides. And there's one that's quite obvious. Increased threat generation because we're relying on Searing Pain as our filler spell for single target. And we'll address how threat affects the Warlock running Fire later on into this video. So while Searing Pain threat is a slight setback, it isn't always. The last con of this build is a slight hindrance on your damage over time. And what I mean by that is, yes, your Immolate is going to be doing pretty good damage. However, Immolate requires the caster to stay in one position while casting, so it does limit your capabilities on placing yourself in a safe place or being able to react to a mob coming near you. Additionally, If you're running the DS Emberstorm build, your Immolate is going to be a bit stronger, but you're missing out on instant cast Corruption, which is also going to limit your AoE multi-dot capabilities. Also, remember that Searing Pain and Immolate do not scale as well with spell power when compared to Shadow Bolt and Corruption. So while this build will reach its damage ceiling slightly more consistently than the Shadow build will have a higher damage ceiling and reach it less consistently. Alright, let's finally talk about what is on everybody's mind. Is this increase in threat generation going to be a problem though? Well, the answer is not so simple. Most trash in AQ40 is tauntable, and oftentimes, while dealing damage to trash mobs, we want to be AoEing anyway, such as almost all the bug packs like the Guardians, Warriors, and oftentimes the Stinger packs before Princess Huhuran. In which case, you're not going to be dealing massive amounts of threat, just a little bit extra since you're doing more fire damage overall. As for the trash packs after Twin Emperors, meaning the Mind Flayers and the Lashers, the Warlock will want to be tab targeting to apply their curse assignment on the mobs, and also can put Immolate on all the various mobs as well to do multi-dotting, and really trying to push their damage in these trash packs. In this case, the player is still not generating much extra threat at all. The only time the threat generation of the Warlock becomes an issue is on bosses when the player wants to cast Searing Pain over and over and over and over without any hesitation. But during these trash pulls, you're either going to be AoEing or spending many globals getting your curse assignment out, getting Immolates out, and then starting to cast Searing Pain. So let's go over how this is actually going to affect us in practice against these bosses. Prophet Scarum, the first boss, is tauntable, as are all of his clones. This boss dies so incredibly quickly for most guilds that oftentimes the boss is simply just splitting every few seconds, causing the warriors to taunt regularly, and your warriors are going to be wanting to taunt after a split regardless. Meaning this boss is not really going to be affected too much by our increased threat generation. Next is the Bug Trio. This boss fight allows for multi-dotting with Immolate, so already you have a significant threat generation decrease because of the time you put towards keeping up multiple Immolate dots. If you still manage to pull threat on one of the targets, you're able to use Limited Invulnerability Potion while waiting for the tank to use Taunt and bring the boss back to them. For Battleguard Sartura, not only is this boss also tauntable, but most guilds go for a CC strategy where they chain stun the adds and AoE them down while the tank is taunting the main boss to keep her from going on random raid members. So the Warlock will not actually be generating significant additional threat since they'll be focusing on AoEing her adds down. Even if your guild does not use this AoE strategy and instead spreads apart the mobs, then that means the Warlock will still need to be doing multiple curse assignments and multiple Immolates, giving more and more time that they're not casting Searing Pain and not generating additional threat. After her adds are down, the player will want to start pumping Searing Pains into the boss, but by that time the main tank will already have a significant threat lead and will still be rotating taunts to keep Sartura from running off. Next, let's look at Fankris. As we all know, Fankris is generally just a tank and spank fight where the raid nukes down the boss as fast as possible. In this encounter, the Warlock will indeed generate much more threat than usual because they'll be looking to spam Searing Pain a lot. Alright, so Princess Huhuran is going to be a little bit different. This boss is one of the few bosses that is not tauntable. With that said, it is possible to have dangerous amounts of threat here as well, but still unlikely for the player to pull threat since this boss oftentimes is where the melee, especially the warriors, are looking to pop cooldowns so that they can execute the boss as quickly as possible to cheese the last phase of the boss, where she outputs a lot of poison damage. In this case, the tank will be generating more threat than usual if they're popping their offensive cooldowns. Now on to the Twin Emperors. This is a fight that we actually want to be generating more threat, and a fight that is great for fire spec. Not only are you going to be doing more damage on this fight since you're primarily only casting fire spells during this fight, but the extra threat generation from you doing more damage is also going to be great for the rest of the casters on your team, allowing them to go that much harder into the boss. Oro is yet another fight that is great for the Fire Warlock. Oro can't be taunted, but that's okay. Oftentimes, raids lose a ton of damage on this boss because of many of their melee end up eating the Sandblast ability from Oro and waste juicy DPS uptime by being stuck spinning. Well, as a Fire Warlock, you can click off Blessing of Salvation or get rid of Tranquil Air Totem, stand off to the side away from everyone, and nuke as much threat into the boss as you want. By doing this, you force the boss to target you with one of the opening Sandblasts, allowing your main tank and melee to keep nuking the boss and not have their threat be wiped. Now the last boss, Cthulhu, let's just keep this one short and sweet. As we all know, in both phases 1 and 2 of this encounter, the boss doesn't actually have any sort of threat table. In fact, the boss doesn't need to be tanked whatsoever. The only mobs that need to be tanked are the tentacles here, which also can't come and attack you. They remain stationary. So threat here is a non-issue. So is Fire Spec the spec for Warlocks in AQ40? Well, it can get incredibly high crit chance and reach its damage potential very reliably. Also, it is a great spec to use for speedrunning guilds that are looking to use less than 3 Warlocks, and it saves debuff slots. Not to mention that it excels in strategies that involve heavy AoE, where the Warlock is able to cast Hellfire or Rain of Fire. Although this all sounds nice, it is important to remember its downsides as well. It puts additional pressure on your tanks at times, does not scale as well as Shadow does as you get more gear. Overall, if you're a guild interested in trying speedruns and have cleanly organized raids, I would 100% recommend this build. It does pretty good damage single target and is a ton of fun to play. But if your guild often wipes an AQ, has a hard time keeping their world buffs, or maybe you're just new to playing Warlock in general and aren't quite comfortable with your class or its threat output yet, then I think the spec can be a bit risky. Let me know what you guys think of the spec. Have you tried it before after I teased it in the previous videos? Did you enjoy it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I'd really like to hear back from you guys.